What happens when a laugh at 35,000 feet becomes the most expensive mistake of someone's life. Picture this: a quiet woman in seat 2A, dressed simply, speaking with a soft accent. She asks for sparkling water. A senior flight attendant smirks, repeats her words back like a cruel joke, and decides she doesn't belong in first class. Passengers glance away. The cabin hums with silence, but what no one knows, what even the crew doesn't realize, is that the woman they've chosen to belittle isn't just another passenger. She is the unseen force who has just bought the entire airline. Who is she really? Why does she remain calm when most of us would explode? And how does one flight, one sneer, transform into a chain reaction that shakes an entire industry? This isn't just about customer service. It's about power, dignity, and the cost of prejudice. And once the truth is revealed, nothing at 35,000 feet or on the ground will ever be the same. If stories of resilience, justice, and transformation move you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because now we begin the journey. What happens when a sneer at 36,000 feet becomes the most expensive mistake of your life? The hum of engines filled the cabin like a steady heartbeat. Outside the double-paned windows, the night sky stretched in endless velvet, pricked with stars that seemed suspended only for those traveling between continents. Inside the first-class cabin of Sky Nova Airlines Flight 708, the mood was meant to be serene. Soft amber lighting cast a warm glow over polished wood panels, supple leather seats, and crystal glasses that waited for champagne. It was a world designed to soothe, to signal importance, to whisper to its passengers that they mattered. For most, it worked. For one woman, it was background noise. Dr. Amara Lewis sat quietly in seat 2A. Her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp, scanning through a thick binder of technical blueprints and financial projections. She wore a charcoal suit tailored with understated precision, paired with a simple watch and a single gold ring. Her hair, styled in intricate braids, spilled softly over one shoulder. To the other passengers, she might have looked like an executive traveling for business, perhaps a consultant or strategist. What none of them knew was that she was far more. Amara wasn't just another passenger on this flight. She was the silent force who had, only a week earlier, signed papers making her the controlling shareholder of Sky Nova Airlines. And tonight, as the plane cruised over the dark Atlantic, she was conducting her first inspection, not of aircraft maintenance or financial reports, but of culture. She wanted to see how her airline treated people when it thought no one important was watching. The chime sounded, signaling the cabin crew's freedom to move. The curtain to the galley parted, and in walked the woman who would unknowingly set her own career on fire. Helen Crawford, senior flight attendant, had worked these transatlantic routes for more than 25 years. With her sharp features, hair scraped into a severe bun, and a smile that never touched her pale eyes, she exuded the authority of someone who considered herself queen of the cabin. She was respected, feared, and, to some, resented. To Helen, first class was her stage, and every passenger was to be sorted into categories: old money, new money, celebrities, and the one she quietly despised, those who didn't fit. Her eyes fell on Amara, and the calculus began. Black, rare in her first-class section, expensive suit, yes, but not flashy. No oversized jewelry to announce wealth. The accent when Amara softly asked for sparkling water with lime was refined, musical, a blend of American clarity with hints of Nigerian cadence. To Helen's mind, it was a signal. She tilted her head, and for just a fraction of a second, her lips curved in a sneer before she plastered on her professional smile. "Of course," she said sweetly, drawing out the vowels as though speaking to a child. "Sparklin' water. We can manage that for you." The tone was sugar-coated poison. Amara caught it. She always did. She felt the familiar prick of irritation crawl up her spine. She had heard that tone her entire life from teachers who doubted her brilliance, from investors who dismissed her cadence as hard to follow, from strangers who assumed her presence in boardrooms was accidental. Tonight, she chose the same response she had mastered years ago, a calm expression, a neutral nod, a soft thank you. Helen turned briskly and walked to the galley. Inside, a younger attendant, Sophia Delgado, was arranging glasses for the drink service. Bright-eyed, barely a year into her career, Sophia embodied enthusiasm. Helen leaned in, lowering her voice. "Sparkling water with lime," she repeated in a mocking imitation of Amara's accent. "Can you believe it? Some people—" Sophia froze, glancing toward the cabin. "She seems perfectly polite to me," she whispered. "Oh, they always are at first." Helen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You can always tell. Probably upgraded on points or a payout from some lawsuit. They get a taste of this world and think they belong." Sophia hesitated, uneasy, but said nothing. Helen grabbed the glass, placed the lime inside with unnecessary force, and carried it back down the aisle. When she set it on Amara's tray table, she did so with a little too much weight. Water sloshed over the rim, wetting the napkin. "There you are," she said brightly. "Enjoy." Amara picked up the napkin, dabbed at the spill, and without so much as a sigh, returned to her binder. She did not complain. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for a supervisor. Instead, she made a note in her mind, sharp and deliberate. Her success had never come from reacting emotionally to small acts of disrespect. It came from strategy, from patience, from striking with precision at the right time. Tonight was no different. As Helen moved through the cabin, Amara continued reading, but her focus split. Part of her tracked every move, every word, every microaggression. Her patience wasn't silence, it was observation. And Helen Crawford, without knowing it, had just stepped into an invisible spotlight. Hours stretched out across the Atlantic night. Plates of food clinked softly, glasses refilled. Flight attendants moved gracefully, or in Helen's case, curtly through the aisles. Most passengers were unaware of the small tension simmering between seat 2A and the woman in the gray uniform. But one man noticed. Charles Whitman, seated diagonally in 3B, a retired investment banker with silver hair and the easy authority of wealth, watched closely. He had traveled this route more times than he could count. He knew service rhythms, tone, subtleties, and he recognized something was off. The condescension toward the woman in 2A wasn't just imagined. He had seen it before, subtle but sharp, usually directed at those whom flight attendants assumed wouldn't complain. Charles leaned back in his seat, thoughtful. He had a feeling this flight was going to be memorable. Meanwhile, Amara adjusted the papers in her binder. A chart of projected savings from optimized transoceanic fuel consumption stared back at her. Numbers, equations, algorithms, the language she had built her empire on. It calmed her, but the sting of Helen's voice still lingered. She took a slow breath. Her father's words echoed in memory. "Your accent is the music of your history. Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of your song. Amara lifted her glass, took a deliberate sip, and set it down gently. Across the aisle, Helen's eyes darted back toward her, expecting a reaction, a complaint, a flash of anger. None came. Only that unnerving calm. For Helen, it was almost disappointing. For Amara, it was strategy, because this wasn't just another flight. This was her flight, her airline, her test, and Helen Crawford had just failed it. The engines hummed steadily above the Atlantic. But Amara Lewis's mind drifted far from the leather seat of 2A. While Helen Crawford moved briskly up and down the aisle, projecting her authority with every step, Amara was no longer listening to her voice. Instead, her memory carried her thousands of miles and decades away, back to the small house in Houston, Texas, where her story had truly begun. Her parents, Emmanuel and Grace Lewis, had arrived from Lagos in the late 1970s with little more than 2 suitcases and an iron determination. Emmanuel had been a chemical engineering lecturer back home. Brilliant, but underpaid. Grace was a pediatrician with a reputation for compassion that stretched far beyond her clinic. In Houston, they built a modest life surrounded by stacks of books, late-night debates, and the constant reminder that knowledge was a currency no one could steal. For young Amara, their words became scripture. Her father often told her, "Your voice carries history. Every syllable, every cadence is the echo of your ancestors. Never let anyone shrink you because of it." Those words became armor. At school, when classmates teased her accent, she returned home and turned it into fuel. When teachers underestimated her, she answered not with defiance but with achievement. By the time most children were riding bikes and playing tag, Amara was launching homemade rockets from the driveway, scribbling calculations in spiral notebooks, and programming on an old computer her father rescued from the university discard pile. Science, for her, was more than passion. It was destiny. By the time she graduated high school, she had a full scholarship to MIT. The transition from Houston to Cambridge was both thrilling and punishing. There, she learned that brilliance was not always enough. Professors admired her intellect, but peers dismissed her. Social circles remained exclusive, and her accent again became the subject of subtle ridicule. Yet, with every challenge, Amara doubled down. She earned both her bachelor's and doctorate in aerospace engineering, focusing on propulsion systems that would later reshape aviation. But intellect alone couldn't satisfy her. She saw the chasm between theory and practice, between engineering marvels and the machinery of industry. So she crossed into unfamiliar territory: business. At Stanford's Graduate School of Business, she walked into lecture halls filled with aspiring CEOs, venture capitalists, and heirs to empires. She was often the only black woman in the room. Her ideas were sharp, her models groundbreaking, but too often interrupted by comments like, "Could you repeat that? I can't quite follow your cadence." Each slight was a stone placed in her pocket. She refused to drown beneath them. Instead, she stacked them into a foundation, graduating top of her class. Amara turned down corporate offers that promised wealth but little autonomy. Instead, with seed money scraped from her parents' savings and a handful of believers, she started her company in a garage in Palo Alto. Vector Path Dynamics was her rebellion against limits. Her breakthrough came with a revolutionary algorithm, a system capable of optimizing flight paths in real time, shaving millions in fuel costs. At first, airlines laughed her off. They trusted their entrenched systems, their legacy giants like Boeing and Airbus. But desperation breeds opportunity. A struggling cargo airline agreed to test her software. Within 6 months, their fuel consumption dropped by 18%. The industry gasped. Contracts poured in. Within a decade, VectorPath became the backbone of global aviation logistics. The software ran on 70% of commercial aircraft worldwide. Amara became wealthy beyond measure. When a tech conglomerate acquired her firm for billions, she could have vanished into retirement. But comfort was never her endgame. She had spent too many years as an outsider, watching airlines stumble not just in technology but in humanity. She saw exhausted crews punished by rigid systems, passengers treated as inconveniences rather than people, and microaggressions allowed to fester unchecked. Sky Nova Airlines, once a symbol of prestige, had sunk into mediocrity, its customer service criticized, its financials sinking. Where others saw decay, Amara saw potential. Quietly, she began acquiring stock, then debt, then control. Piece by piece, she became the hidden architect of Sky Nova's future. Only a handful of people knew. Not the board, not the executives, and certainly not Helen Crawford bustling self-importantly in the cabin tonight. This flight was her field study, her silent audit, and what she had seen already told her everything she needed to know. As she sipped the last of her sparkling water, Amara let her gaze drift across the cabin. Charles Whitman sat with his legs crossed, reading the Financial Times, but his occasional glances toward her suggested he had noticed the slides. Sophia Delgado, the junior attendant, avoided Helen's eyes, her discomfort plain each time her senior sneered. These small dynamics were windows into culture, and culture, Amara knew, could make or break empires. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. Beneath the calm exterior, her mind wrestled with the dual weight she always carried. She thought of her mother, Grace, who had once worked double shifts at the hospital so Amara could attend math camps and robotics programs. She thought of the venture capitalist who had cut her off mid-pitch years ago with a dismissive laugh about her cadence. She thought of the lonely nights at MIT, where she buried her isolation in equations. All of it, every wound, every triumph, had prepared her for this moment. But even now, sitting as the unseen owner of the very airline she was flying, a whisper of doubt sometimes crept in. Was she being too harsh in her judgments? Was Helen merely tired, hardened by decades of service rather than poisoned by prejudice? Amara opened her eyes. Helen's voice carried from the galley, sharp, mocking once again. Sophia's silence hung heavy. No, this wasn't fatigue, this was entitlement. Entitlement left unchecked becomes culture. Culture left unchecked becomes poison. Amara's resolve tightened. She returned to her binder, flipping to the final pages where her communications team had drafted a press release. The words stared back at her with quiet power. Sky Nova Airlines acquired by aerospace innovator Dr. Amara Lewis. Immediate leadership overhaul announced. She read the headline 3 times. Each repetition was less about words and more about purpose. She had not purchased Sky Nova simply to own an airline. She had purchased it to remake it, to infuse it with the lesson her father had given her when she was a girl, that every voice is a story, and stories are strength. She looked across the aisle at Helen, who was now placing a tray in front of Charles with saccharine politeness, saving her barbs for easier targets. Helen glanced back at Amara briefly. perhaps to check for a reaction. Amara gave none, only a calm, steady gaze that revealed nothing and everything. The irony of it all nearly made her smile. Helen believed she was putting Amara in her place. In truth, Amara was silently putting Helen in hers. The descent into New York was still hours away, but for Helen Crawford, the wheels of fate were already turning, and for Dr. Amara Lewis, the future of Skynova Airlines was already rewriting itself in invisible ink. The engines droned on, the stars outside wheeled silently across the heavens, and inside Seat 2A, a woman who had turned every slide into steel and every doubt into fire, quietly prepared to transform an empire. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as dinner service began. The Atlantic stretched endlessly below, a dark canvas pricked with distant stars. In the sanctuary of first class, every gesture, every interaction carried weight. For Dr. Amara Lewis, it was not simply a meal, it was another test of the culture she had just inherited. And for Helen Crawford, it was a stage where her instincts for control and quiet disdain revealed themselves in sharper relief. Helen moved down the aisle with her notepad already tucked under her arm, a small but deliberate sign that decisions had been made, orders had been finalized, and any requests not already accounted for were inconveniences. She took the order of the couple in 1A and 1B with flawless efficiency, a smile that bloomed like a flower in the sun. When she reached Charles Whitman in 2C, her tone softened further, respectful, deferential to his well-tailored suit and unmistakable aura of old money. Then she turned. Her eyes landed on Amara. For a moment she hesitated, then continued without pause, skipping 2A entirely. She stepped past Amara and went directly to the passenger in 3A. Amara blinked once, her face expressionless, but her mind sharpened with recognition. This was no oversight. It was a calculated move. To Helen, Amara was invisible until it was convenient to acknowledge her. That invisibility was the purest insult. Sophia Delgado, trailing behind with a cart of linens, glanced nervously at Amara, then back at Helen. She opened her mouth as if to remind her senior of the skipped seat, but caught Helen's warning glance and fell silent. The junior attendant's discomfort was palpable. Amara folded her hands neatly in her lap and waited. Her patience was a weapon she had mastered years ago. She watched Helen glide down the aisle, taking every order but hers. Finally, after closing her notepad with a snap, Helen returned to 2A as though approaching an afterthought, and for you, Helen's voice was smooth but edged, the question delivered with a touch of impatience. The implication was clear. Amara had delayed the service. "I'll have the seared salmon, please," Amara said evenly. Helen made a small sound, half sigh, half dismissive chuckle. "I'll have to see if we still have any left. It's been very popular tonight." Both women knew it was a lie. First class was always provisioned with enough of each entree to cover every passenger. The statement was not about food. It was about status. Helen was testing how far she could push. "Very well," Amara replied calmly. She neither smiled nor frowned, only inclined her head as though she had agreed to a trivial suggestion. She would not give Helen the satisfaction of visible irritation. From across the aisle, Charles Whitman lowered his newspaper. His eyes flicked between the two women, understanding at once the silent war taking place. He had traveled too often not to recognize the choreography of contempt. When Helen returned, she placed the salmon in front of Amara with a click louder than necessary. The plate hidden the table with the sharp edge of sound. A few drops of sauce spattered onto the linen. Helen did not acknowledge it. She turned her back at once and moved on. Amara reached for her napkin, dabbed the spill without a word, and began eating. Each motion was measured, deliberate. Her calmness infuriated Helen. Amara could see it in the stiff lines of the attendant's shoulders as she walked away. A bully thrives on reaction. Deprived of it, the bully becomes unsettled. Later, as trays were being cleared, Helen reached across to remove Amara's plate. Her elbow jostled the cup of coffee Amara had placed beside her documents. The cup tipped dangerously, a line of dark liquid threatening to spill across the binder. "Oh, do be careful," Helen said, her tone sugared with mock concern, as if the fault were Amara's. Amara steadied the cup with a single movement, her eyes never leaving Helen's. "Thank you for the reminder," she said quietly. The words were polite, but beneath them lay a steel edge. Sophia, lingering behind with the service cart, caught the exchange. The flicker of shame in her eyes was unmistakable. She knew what she was witnessing, but felt powerless to intervene. As the cabin settled into post-dinner stillness, Amara opened her binder once more. Schematics and reports filled the pages, but her focus was divided. Every microaggression, every carefully measured insult was being recorded in her memory, not in anger, but in strategy. She had not come this far to react emotionally. She'd come to observe, to diagnose, and ultimately, to cure. Her thoughts flickered to her parents again, her father's voice echoing, "Your accent is the music of your history." Her mother's steady reminder that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered. Tonight, she was determined to keep it intact, to let Helen write her own downfall one cruel gesture at a time. An hour later, the test escalated. Amara reached for her laptop to review a confidential document. She tried to plug it into the power outlet beneath her seat. Nothing. She pressed the call button. Sophia appeared first, her face open and helpful. "Is everything all right?" "Ma'am, yes," Amara said gently. "The outlet doesn't seem to be working." Sophia crouched to inspect it, her hands deft and professional. "Sometimes they're tricky. Let me reset it from our panel." Before she could rise, Helen's shadow loomed. "What seems to be the problem now?" she asked, her voice sharp with irritation. "The power outlet isn't working," Amara explained once more, evenly. Helen bent down, peered at the plug with exaggerated exasperation, then shoved it hard. Nothing happened. She straightened with a theatrical sigh. "You have to push it all the way in. Some people don't realize that." Her tone was dripping with condescension. "It appears to be faulty," Amara replied. "Well," Helen said loudly, "there's nothing I can do mid-flight. You'll just have to manage without. Engineering will look at it on the ground." She turned as if the matter were closed. No offer of an alternate seat, no apology for a failed amenity in the most expensive cabin. Before Amara could respond, Charles Whitman lowered his paper and spoke. His voice was calm but firm, the authority of wealth and age unmistakable. "Excuse me, that is not an acceptable response." Helen froze, caught off guard. "I beg your pardon, sir. The outlet is broken," Charles said plainly. "This lady has paid for a seat that includes a functioning power source. Your job is not to sigh and walk away, but to find a solution. Is there another open seat in the cabin she can move to so she can work?" Helen's face flushed, trapped between her disdain for Amara and her deference to Charles. I would have to check the manifest. Sir, then please do so, Charles said, leaving no room for argument. Helen walked briskly back to the galley, her steps heavy with suppressed anger. Minutes later, she returned, her expression sour. The passenger in 4A disembarked early at Shannon. That seat is available. The outlet functions. Wonderful, Charles said. He looked at Amara, his eyes kind. There you have it. Amara inclined her head. Thank you for your assistance, she said to Charles, genuine gratitude in her tone. She then turned to Helen, her face unreadable, and thank you for finding a solution. The words, polite on the surface, landed like quiet thunder. She gathered her laptop and binder, rose gracefully, and walked to 4A. Settling into the seat, she plugged in the adapter. The charging light glowed steady green. The symbolism was not lost on her. Power had been restored. Behind her, Helen muttered something to Sophia, her voice a low hiss. Amara caught the words anyway. Can you believe the nerve getting other passengers to fight her battles? So typical. Amara opened the file she had intended to review. It was the final draft of the press release. Sky Nova Airlines acquired by Dr. Amara Lewis. Immediate leadership overhaul announced. She read the headline again, a grim sense of irony washing over her. Helen thought she had scored a small victory tonight. But, in truth, she had demonstrated precisely why Sky Nova needed to change. The cabin lights glowed warm and low. Around her, passengers settled into movies or drifted into sleep. But, for Amara, the flight had become a living case study. Every moment added evidence to her mental ledger, and that ledger would soon be paid in full. For Helen Crawford, every sneer and sigh was another nail in the coffin of her career. She simply didn't know it yet. The cabin lights shifted into a soft golden hue, signaling the final hour before landing. Outside, the Atlantic had given way to the dark stretch of the American East Coast. Somewhere below lay New York City, a city that promised beginnings for some and endings for others. For Dr. Amara Lewis, it would be both. Passengers stirred from naps, adjusted reclined seats, and tucked away loose belongings. A faint hum of anticipation filled the air, the unspoken restlessness of travelers eager to disembark. But within the first-class cabin, a quieter storm churned. It was not in the engines or the weather, but in the tightening grip of authority that Helen Crawford refused to relinquish. Helen bustled through the aisle with her checklist, her posture rigid, her voice sharp over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our descent into New York, please ensure your seat backs are upright, tray tables stowed, and electronic devices switched off or placed in airplane mode. Her tone was brisk, almost triumphant, as though the end of the flight meant her small victories would remain unchallenged. Amara closed her binder carefully and slid it into her leather briefcase. Her face remained calm, but her thoughts were anything but placid. She replayed every moment of the flight in her mind, the sneer at her accent, the deliberate neglect during meal service, the dismissive sigh over the broken outlet. Each insult had been small enough to dismiss individually. Together, they formed a pattern too dangerous to ignore. This was not just about her. It was about a system that had allowed behavior like Helen's to thrive unchecked. As she buckled her seatbelt, she glanced across the aisle. Charles Whitman was watching her quietly, his eyes steady with unspoken solidarity. He had seen enough to know the truth. His nod, subtle but deliberate, was a reminder that she was not alone. Sofia Delgado, meanwhile, moved with hesitant steps behind Helen, her expression conflicted. She had witnessed everything, and her conscience gnawed at her. The training under the new Hayes-inspired initiative had encouraged employees to stand against toxic behavior, but fear of retaliation kept her rooted. Every glance at Amara deepened her guilt. The Airbus A350 glided lower through thin clouds, New York's glittering lights shimmering in the distance. The familiar chime of the seatbelt sign rang, and the descent became real. For most passengers, it was routine. For Amara, it was the prelude to a reckoning. As the wheels kissed the tarmac with a smooth screech, applause broke out among a few travelers. Helen's voice returned on the intercom, controlled and proud. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate, and the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign. Thank you for choosing Skynova Airlines." Her authority rang final, but beneath her words, Amara heard the faintest crack. Helen believed she had won the battle, but she had yet to realize she had already lost the war. The aircraft rolled toward the gate, engines humming in gradual deceleration. Helen moved to the front of the cabin, her place at the door a position she regarded as a throne. She smoothed her uniform, adjusted her name badge, and prepared her farewell smiles for those she deemed worthy. She greeted Charles first, her voice dripping with honey. "Goodbye, Mr. Whitman. Always a pleasure to have you on board." Charles paused, fixing her with a firm look. "Your service on this flight was some of the most unprofessional I have ever witnessed," he said in a low but steady voice, ensuring only she could hear. "You should be ashamed." Without waiting for her reaction, he stepped onto the jet bridge, his words hanging heavy in the air. Helen's face flushed scarlet. The sting of rebuke from a man she respected cut deeper than any confrontation with Amara. Her mask slipped, just for a second, and fear flickered in her eyes. Then came Amara. She rose gracefully, her briefcase in one hand, her poise unshaken. She walked toward the door, each step measured, deliberate. Helen braced herself, expecting an outburst, a complaint, something she could dismiss as hysterical. Instead, Amara stopped in front of her, met her eyes with that same unnerving calm, and spoke in a voice so soft it carried more weight than a shout. "Please remain on the aircraft. The ground supervisor and the head of in-flight operations need to speak with you." Helen blinked, her jaw tightened. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the pressure. Amara leaned in slightly, her words a whisper, heavy with finality. "I'm the person who signs the checks." The color drained from Helen's face. Her lips parted, but no words came. In that instant, the fortress of authority she had built for 2 decades crumbled into dust. She was no longer the master of this domain. She was exposed. Amara turned without waiting for a reply and stepped onto the jet bridge. Waiting there were 3 figures in the sharp suits: the JFK station manager, the senior vice president of in-flight operations, Michael Corian, and the CEO of Skynova Airlines himself, Robert Lane. Their faces were a mixture of dread and determination. They knew what this moment meant. They had been warned. Robert stepped forward, his hand clammy, his voice faltering. "Dr. Lewis, welcome. I want to extend my deepest apologies for whatever transpired on board. I had no idea you were flying with us tonight." "That was the point," Amara replied, her voice crisp, professional. I wanted to see this airline as a passenger, not as its owner, and what I saw was unacceptable. Her gaze shifted briefly to the aircraft door, where Helen lingered, pale and trembling, her world unraveling in silence. Amara let the moment linger, let the weight of truth sink in. Then she turned back to Robert, her tone steady as steel. My first directive as majority owner is simple. Miss Crawford's employment is to be terminated immediately. Her credentials revoked before she leaves this airport. She will not work another flight. Michael swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, Dr. Lewis, absolutely. But Amara wasn't finished. And this isn't about one employee. Do not insult my intelligence by suggesting this is isolated. It is a symptom of a culture that has been allowed to rot. If I experience this in 7 hours, imagine what countless passengers face daily. That ends tonight. Robert's forehead glistened with sweat. His authority, once unshakable, seemed fragile in front of her unwavering presence. Consider this ground zero for the new Sky Nova, Amara continued. Respect is not optional. It is the core of this company's survival. Behind her, Helen's knees nearly buckled. She clutched the frame of the aircraft door for balance, her breath shallow. Every word cut away the remnants of her illusion. The new reality was undeniable. She was finished. Amara stepped aside. Deal with your staff member, she instructed. I have a board meeting to attend. She turned toward the terminal, her heels clicking against the jet bridge floor. Each step a drum beat of change. The executives moved past her toward the trembling attendant. Helen's protests began in whispers, then rose into pleas, her voice cracking with desperation. But the station manager's tone was cold, final. Hand over your ID and credentials. Now. Passengers disembarking glanced sideways, whispering as the scene unfolded in plain sight. There would be no hiding this, no shielding Helen from the truth. Her downfall was public, swift, and absolute. Amara did not look back. She had no need to. The ledger had been closed, the debt had been collected, and the cost of prejudice had come due. As she stepped into the terminal, the hum of the airport washed over her, a symphony of motion and possibility. She felt the weight of responsibility settling firmly on her shoulders, but alongside it, a quiet satisfaction. Tonight, she had not just defended her dignity. She had set the course for an empire reborn. The night air beyond the terminal windows shimmered with the glow of the city. For Amara Lewis, this was not the end of a journey. It was the beginning. The sterile hum of JFK's jet bridge gave way to the quieter, almost oppressive silence of the airport's restricted corridors. The walls were plain white, lined with emergency exit maps and faded posters about employee conduct. It was a space Amara Lewis had walked before in other contexts, meetings and inspections, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it was the theater of accountability. Behind her, Helen Crawford was escorted by the station manager and Michael Corian. Her face had lost its carefully maintained composure. Without the armor of the uniform's prestige and the deferential smiles of passengers, she looked smaller, diminished. Her eyes darted around the corridor as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. Each step forward was a step deeper into consequences she could not avoid. Amara walked a few paces ahead, her briefcase still in hand, her stride steady. She did not need to turn back. She could hear Helen's shallow breathing, could almost feel the desperation radiating off her. In Amara's mind, though, there was no room for pity, Not yet. Not until the culture that Helen embodied was dismantled root and branch. They reached a small conference room with frosted glass windows and a long laminate table. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. It was not a boardroom, not a courtroom, but tonight it would serve as both. Robert Lane was already there, seated stiffly at the far end, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. His tie was loosened, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but he stood quickly when Amara entered. "Dr. Lewis," Robert began, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for giving us the chance to address this." His words were an attempt at contrition, but Amara simply raised a hand. "Not yet. Robert, we will talk soon. For now, this is about accountability." Helen remained by the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the badge clipped to her blazer trembling with every shallow breath. Her lips parted as if to speak, but Michael's voice cut through first. "Miss Crawford, please take a seat. She obeyed, sinking into the chair as though gravity had doubled in weight. The silence stretched. It was Amara who broke it, her voice calm but carrying the weight of final judgment. "Miss Crawford, I want you to understand why you are here. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not a passenger complaint blown out of proportion. This is a reckoning with a pattern of behavior that has no place in this company, or in any company that values dignity." Helen's face twisted, half defiance, half fear. "I was only doing my job. That woman." She stopped abruptly, realizing too late how those words betrayed her prejudice. "That woman was me," Amara replied, her tone sharp but controlled. "And even if I had been just another passenger, your treatment would still have been unacceptable. Disrespect is not part of the job. Condescension is not customer service, and prejudice is not professionalism." Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away Helen's defenses. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two women. Michael kept his gaze steady on Helen, his expression unreadable but stern. The station manager slid a folder across the table. Inside were the termination papers. Helen glanced at them, her breath quickening. Termination. On the spot, her voice cracked under the strain. 20 years of service, gone because of one passenger's opinion. Not one opinion, Amara corrected smoothly. Multiple witnesses. Documented behavior. A culture of disdain that you embodied. You were given authority, and you weaponized it against those you judged as unworthy. Today, you judge the wrong person. Helen opened her mouth again, perhaps to plead, perhaps to protest. But the station manager's voice left no room for maneuver. "Your credentials, please, now." Helen's hands shook as she unclipped her ID badge and slid it across the table. The sound of the plastic scraping against the laminate was louder than any engine roar she had heard in her career. It was the sound of her identity being severed. Her shoulders slumped, her fight gone, replaced with a hollow look of disbelief. She had always believed herself untouchable. Now she was disposable. Amara did not gloat, she simply observed, her face calm, her eyes steady. "This is not about destroying you, Miss Crawford. This is about protecting every future passenger and every future employee from a culture that allowed this to happen. Consider this a mirror held up to your career. Whether you like what you see is not my concern." Helen swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. She said nothing more. She gathered her purse with trembling hands and followed the station manager out of the room. The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt like the end of an era. For a moment, the room was silent again. Robert Lane exhaled heavily, rubbing his forehead. Michael cleared his throat. "Dr. Lewis, I want to personally apologize." Amara cut him off gently but firmly. "Save the apologies. They do nothing for the passengers who have been humiliated or the employees who have been silenced under toxic leadership. What I want is action." She set her briefcase on the table, opening it with deliberate precision. From inside, she pulled out a slim folder, its cover stamped with the Sky Nova logo. She slid it across to Robert. "This is the framework for the reforms I intend to implement immediately. I call it the Lewis Initiative. It is not negotiable." Robert opened the folder, his eyes scanning the bullet points with growing unease. Comprehensive inclusivity training, ongoing, not annual. A confidential reporting system for both employees and customers, with direct escalation to senior leadership. A dignity in service bonus program to reward respectful, exemplary behavior. And a partnership program with historically underrepresented universities to build a pipeline for diverse pilots, engineers, and executives. He looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "This will change everything. That is the point." Amara said simply, "If you want Sky Nova to survive, it cannot just be an airline. It must become a symbol of dignity in flight. Otherwise, it will collapse under the weight of its own indifference." Michael leaned forward, his voice steady but cautious. "Dr. Lewis, the scope of this, it will meet resistance from unions, from shareholders, even from longtime executives." Amara met his gaze, unwavering. Resistance is irrelevant. Transformation is non-negotiable. The only question is whether the leadership of this airline has the courage to enact it. Her words hung heavy in the air, a gauntlet thrown at their feet. Robert closed the folder slowly, his expression a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. He nodded once, then again, more firmly. "You have my support. Dr. Lewis, we will make this happen." "Good," Amara replied, standing and collecting her briefcase. "Tomorrow morning, we meet with the full board, and I expect every one of you to be ready to defend this vision, not to me, but to the future of this company." She paused at the doorway, turning back just once. Tonight was ground zero. The old culture has ended. What rises from here is up to all of us. With that, she stepped into the corridor, her heels echoing against the sterile tiles. Behind her, Robert and Michael sat in heavy silence, the weight of a new era pressing down on their shoulders. Outside, the terminal bustled with passengers and luggage carts, oblivious to the revolution that had just begun in a quiet conference room. For Helen Crawford, the night was the collapse of everything she thought she controlled. For Amara Lewis, it was only the beginning. The foundation of change had been laid. Now came the building. The morning sun had barely lifted over Manhattan, casting a pale golden light across the skyscrapers of Park Avenue. Inside Sky Nova Airlines' headquarters, the top-floor boardroom was alive with a nervous energy. The polished mahogany table stretched nearly the length of the room, its glossy surface reflecting cups of untouched coffee and open laptops. Seated around it were the company's most powerful executives and board members. Men and women who had grown accustomed to wielding authority were now uneasy, waiting for the woman who had upended everything in a single night. Robert Lane sat at the head of the table, his face pale and drawn. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the confrontation at JFK over and over. Every detail of Amara Lewis's calm authority, every word that cut sharper than a blade had left him shaken. He tugged at his tie and glanced toward the door, where the sound of approaching footsteps echoed like a drumbeat of fate. When the door opened, the room seemed to shift. Amara entered with the quiet composure of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. She wore a simple navy suit, impeccably tailored, paired with understated pearl earrings. Her presence was not flamboyant, not theatrical. It was steady, commanding, undeniable. She placed her leather briefcase on the table, looked around the room, and allowed the silence to stretch. One by one, the executives dropped their gazes, unable to meet her eyes. "Good morning," Amara began, her voice even, calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I trust you all know why we are here." Not a single person spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC system overhead. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, distributing them one by one with deliberate precision. "This," she said, sliding the last folder across the table, "is the Lewis Initiative. It is not a proposal. It is not a suggestion. It is the future of this airline." Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. One, a silver-haired man named Gerald Whitaker, cleared his throat. "Dr. Lewis, we respect your position, but sweeping reforms on this scale—" He stopped when Amara's gaze fixed on him. "Respectfully, Mr. Whitaker," she said, "the old way of doing things nearly killed this company. Sky Nova was drowning in debt, bleeding customer trust, and rotting from within. I did not acquire this airline to maintain the status quo. I acquired it to rebuild it." She turned toward the entire room, her words measured, each one deliberate. "Let me be perfectly clear. What I experienced yesterday was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a disease, a culture of arrogance, condescension, and unchecked prejudice that has festered for years. And it ends now." Her voice rose slightly, not in volume but in force, striking the air like a bell. "If you are unwilling or unable to adapt to this new reality, you will step aside. Effective immediately." The silence was suffocating. Even the normally unflappable CFO, Ellen Hart, fidgeted with her pen, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. Amara flipped open her copy of the initiative and began to outline its pillars. First, comprehensive inclusivity and empathy training. Not a 2-hour video you click through once a year, but an ongoing, immersive program designed by sociologists, behavioral experts, and customer service specialists. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, will participate, no exceptions. Second, a confidential reporting system, available to both employees and passengers, with direct escalation to an independent oversight office. Whistleblowers will be protected, and complaints will no longer disappear into the void of bureaucracy. Third, a dignity and service bonus program. Employees who demonstrate consistent, verified excellence and respectful service will be rewarded financially. Respect will no longer be seen as optional. It will be rewarded as essential. Fourth, partnerships with historically underrepresented universities and institutions to build pipelines for pilots, engineers, and executives. This airline's leadership will reflect the diversity of the world it serves. She paused, letting the words sink in. Her eyes scanned the table, meeting each person's gaze in turn. This is not charity. This is not idealism. This is survival. The modern traveler demands more than a seat and a ticket. They demand dignity. If we cannot provide it, someone else will. The question is whether Sky Nova will be remembered as a cautionary tale of arrogance or a model of transformation. A low murmur spread around the table. Some nodded quietly, others frowned. Gerald Whitaker leaned forward again, his tone sharper this time. And what of the shareholders? What of costs? These programs will not be cheap. They will erode profit margins. Amara met his challenge head-on. Mr. Whitaker, what erodes profits faster? Investing in respect and culture or allowing discrimination scandals to go viral, destroying public trust and tanking stock prices overnight? She let the question hang. We saw the answer yesterday. The cost of prejudice is always higher than the cost of prevention. The room fell quiet again. Amara softened her tone slightly, though her resolve remained unshaken. I know some of you fear change. I know some of you believe the old ways are safer, familiar. But ask yourselves this: what has familiarity done for us? Falling stock, customer complaints, a workforce drained of morale. The old culture is not safe. It is poison. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower, more intimate, drawing them in. I did not buy this airline to watch it wither. I bought it to watch it soar, and I will not tolerate anyone standing in the way of that. Robert Lane, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was soft, but resolute. She is right. We cannot afford to continue as we have. The future is here. We either embrace it or we die. For the first time since the meeting began, his words aligned with Amara's vision. A ripple of recognition moved through the board. Heads nodded slowly. The resistance, while not gone, had softened. Amara straightened, closing her folder. This is not the end of the conversation. This is the beginning. But let me assure you of this: Sky Nova will become the industry leader in dignity, inclusivity, and respect. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. If that frightens you, I suggest you step aside now. Her eyes swept the table one last time. No one moved. The meeting stretched for 2 hours, filled with debate, clarification, and cautious commitments. By the end, the Lewis Initiative had been formally accepted as the new guiding framework for Sky Nova Airlines. Amara gathered her things, preparing to leave. As she reached the door, she turned back, her voice softer but no less commanding. Tomorrow, when we take flight, every passenger must feel not just safe, but seen. That is the new standard. That is Sky Nova's future. She left the room, her heels clicking against the marble floors, each step echoing the sound of a new era. Inside the boardroom, the executives sat in stunned silence. For some, the weight of change felt overwhelming. For others, it felt liberating. But for all of them, one truth was undeniable. The age of complacency had ended. The age of accountability had begun. After the boardroom adjourned, Amara Lewis retreated into her private office overlooking Park Avenue. The morning had been a storm of confrontation, declarations, and reluctant nods of approval. Now, with the city bustling beneath her, she finally allowed herself a deep breath. She lowered into the chair by the window. The weight of her decisions pressing against her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Change had begun. But change was never without resistance. She knew that. She had always known that. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her steady eyes, braids pulled into a neat knot, the calm surface that concealed the endless calculations underneath. But as she gazed out at the skyline, her mind drifted thousands of miles and decades away, back to the Houston neighborhood where her story began. Her parents, Emmanuel and Grace Lewis, had arrived in Texas in the late 1970s with 2 suitcases and a dream that seemed impossible at the time. Emmanuel was a chemical engineer, Grace a pediatrician. They carried themselves with the quiet dignity of people who understood that the world would underestimate them, but that they could never underestimate themselves. The house Amara grew up in was small, lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of science texts, novels, and biographies. Her earliest memories were of her father bending over an engineering diagram at the kitchen table, his thick glasses sliding down his nose, while her mother quizzed her on multiplication tables as dinner simmered on the stove. Education was not just encouraged, it was oxygen. One memory surfaced with striking clarity the day her father held her hands, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Amara, your accent is the music of your history," he told her. "It carries the strength of your grandparents and the journey that brought us here. Never let anyone tell you it makes you less. It makes you more." She was 8 years old, and those words imprinted themselves like a watermark on her soul. Years later, when classmates mimicked her cadence or professors raised eyebrows at her precise diction, she would recall that sentence. It steadied her when the world tried to shake her. As she grew, so did her appetite for knowledge. While other children played hopscotch, Amara was dismantling broken radios and teaching herself rudimentary programming from library books. She built model rockets out of scraps, launching them in the backyard with the precision of a future engineer. Her father watched with pride, her mother with a mixture of awe and concern. "You're chasing the stars," Grace would whisper. "Just promise me you'll never forget the ground you came from." By the time she entered high school, her brilliance was undeniable. Teachers pushed her into advanced courses, though not without resistance from some who doubted a black girl could excel in physics or calculus. Amara absorbed the skepticism like a sponge, squeezing it out as fuel for her resolve. When she received her acceptance letter to MIT with a full scholarship, her mother wept openly in the kitchen. Her father simply nodded, eyes glassy, and whispered, "Now the real journey begins." MIT was both a crucible and a battlefield. In the world of equations, Amara thrived. Her doctoral thesis on ion propulsion would later become a cornerstone of aerospace research. But outside the classroom, the battles were subtler, sharper. Professors who overlooked her in discussions until her calculations proved irrefutable. Classmates who smiled condescendingly, only to borrow her notes before exams. Even in triumph, she felt the sting of being unseen. It was during those years that she began to cultivate the calm exterior that had so disarmed Candace Miller on Flight 982. Anger was a fire. Yes, but if left uncontrolled, it burned indiscriminately. Harnessed, it became propulsion. She would not waste her energy on shouting at closed doors. She would build her own keys. After MIT came Stanford Graduate School of Business. It was there she collided with a different kind of bias, one that cloaked itself in polite smiles and patronizing tones. Her technical brilliance was quantifiable right answers, elegant solutions. But in venture capital, her ideas were met with skepticism. "Honey, could you slow down? Your cadence is a little hard to follow," one investor had said, cutting her mid-pitch. The humiliation was sharp, but the lesson was sharper. She did not crumble. She hardened. She became sharper, clearer, 3 steps ahead of every room she walked into. She graduated top of her class and, instead of settling into a corporate ladder, she carved her own. With her parents' modest savings and a handful of believers, she launched Vector Stream Dynamics in a dusty Palo Alto garage. It began with a radical algorithm optimizing real-time flight paths to slash fuel consumption. The industry laughed at first. Boeing, Airbus, the giants, they saw no reason to entertain a young black woman's vision, but within 6 months of her pilot program with a struggling cargo airline, the data spoke louder than any prejudice. 18% savings. Overnight, skeptics became suitors. Within a decade, Vector Stream's technology guided nearly 3/4 of the world's commercial fleet. By the time she sold the company to a tech conglomerate for billions, Amara was one of the youngest black female billionaires in history. Yet even then, she felt unfinished. Wealth was security, but it wasn't transformation, and that was what had drawn her to Sky Nova, a failing airline with good bones but a rotten heart. An institution that had once symbolized freedom, now shackled by arrogance and mediocrity. She saw in it both a challenge and a mirror. If she could transform it, she could prove perhaps finally to herself that dignity and efficiency were not enemies but allies. Her mind snapped back to the present. She was in her office, not the Palo Alto garage, not the MIT labs, not her childhood kitchen. She was here, now, the owner of an airline, facing the storm of resistance that always came with shaking an institution awake. She thought of Candace Miller, her sneer at 35,000 feet, her disdain dripping like acid. Candace was not unique. She was a symptom of a culture that believed power meant belittling others. Amara pressed her palms together, resting them against her lips. Doubt whispered at the edges of her mind. Could she really shift the weight of 30,000 employees? Could she really rewrite the DNA of a company this vast? Or would the system grind her down as it had so many others who tried to change it? Her father's voice echoed again. Your accent is the music of your history. Her mother's, don't forget the ground you came from. She closed her eyes, letting the voices steady her. She had carried those lessons into every room where she wasn't supposed to belong. They had carried her this far. They would carry her further still. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was Grace Nakamura, the SVP of In-Flight Operations. Dr. Lewis, we've begun the preliminary review of training modules. Would you like a full report this afternoon? Yes, Amara replied softly, her resolve crystallizing once more. And Grace, make sure it's honest. No polishing. I want the truth. She hung up and stood, looking out once more at the city below. The path ahead would not be easy, but then again, nothing in her life had been easy, and every stone the world had thrown at her had only become another brick in her foundation. Amara turned back to her desk, opened the next file, and began planning not just for the next quarter or year, but for the next decade. Sky Nova's rebirth was no longer a question. It was a promise. The glow of the city lingered in Amara's mind long after she left her office that night. New York's skyline had always reminded her of Resilient's steel, glass, and determination rising defiantly into the air. But even steel bent under pressure. And as she rode home in the back of a silent black sedan, Amara couldn't shake the nagging thought that the greatest challenge wasn't acquiring Sky Nova, or even implementing her vision. It was human nature. People resisted change. especially when change threatened the small kingdoms they had carved for themselves inside a failing system. The following week confirmed her fears. Reports trickled in from across the airline, some captains refusing to attend soft skills seminars, dismissing them as beneath their station, middle managers forwarding emails from the new inclusivity task force directly to spam, gate agents whispering that the new boss was trying to turn the airline into a social experiment. At first glance, these were minor acts of resistance, insignificant in the face of sweeping reform. But Amara had studied organizational collapse long enough to know that revolutions weren't undone by explosions. They eroded slowly, through cynicism and sabotage. One particular morning, she sat across from Robert Lane, the airline's long-serving CEO. His polished suit and rehearsed charm did little to hide the unease in his eyes. He cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "Amara, with all due respect, we need to pace ourselves. The crews are unsettled. Too many changes at once could fracture morale." Amara folded her hands, her calm masking the flicker of irritation beneath. "Robert, morale isn't fractured by accountability. It's fractured when people see disrespect go unchecked. The incident with Evelyn Shaw wasn't an isolated outburst. It was a symptom. If we don't move quickly, the message we send is that we tolerate it." He leaned back, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. But you must understand. Seniority carries weight here. Some of these people have decades invested. They won't take kindly to having the rules rewritten overnight." Amara's gaze hardened. Then they'll have to decide if they want to be part of the future or remain in the past. We cannot build excellence on a foundation of arrogance. The conversation ended with polite nods, but Amara walked away certain that Robert wasn't entirely on her side. He was straddling two worlds, the old guard that clung to tradition and the new vision she embodied. That tension would not hold forever. Later that week, she decided to see for herself how her reforms were filtering through the system. She booked a quiet seat 2A, always 2A on a domestic Sky Nova flight from Chicago to Seattle. Officially, she was traveling for meetings with aircraft engineers. Unofficially, it was another undercover audit. The flight was operated by a mid-sized Airbus A321, its first-class cabin already showing signs of age, cracked leather on the armrests, flickering reading lights. But what mattered most wasn't the hardware, it was the human software. A young flight attendant named Jordan was assigned to the first-class cabin. He was earnest, with the nervous energy of someone still finding his rhythm. The purser, however, was different. Her name was Linda Watkins, a veteran of 25 years. She carried herself with the unyielding posture of someone who believed tenure conferred royalty. As boarding wrapped up, Amara noticed a woman in seat 3C, a black business traveler in her 30s, politely asking Linda for assistance stowing her heavy carry-on. Linda's response was laced with the same poisonous courtesy Amara had felt on Flight 982. "I'm sure you can manage, dear," Linda said, her voice flat. She turned and helped a white passenger behind her instead, smiling brightly as she lifted his bag. Amara's chest tightened. The scene was too familiar. Jordan, the junior attendant, noticed too. He stepped forward quickly, taking the bag from the woman in 3C with a reassuring smile. "I've got that for you. Ma'am, welcome aboard." The passenger murmured thanks, relief softening her expression. Linda's jaw tightened, annoyance flashing across her face as if Jordan had undermined her authority. She moved past Amara's row, muttering something under her breath about people expecting special treatment. The plane pushed back, engines roaring. Amara leaned into her seat, eyes half closed, observing. Every moment was a data point, every interaction a thread in the tapestry of culture she was trying to reweave. Halfway through the flight, turbulence rocked the cabin. It wasn't severe, but enough to jostle drinks and trigger nerves. Amara noticed the woman in 3C gripping her armrests, her breathing shallow. Jordan crouched beside her, speaking softly, guiding her through steady breaths. Linda, meanwhile, rolled her eyes, muttering audibly as she passed. Some people act like it's their first time flying. That was the breaking point. Amara's pulse steadied into steel. She pressed the call button. Jordan appeared quickly. "Yes, ma'am, can I help?" Amara's voice was calm but firm. "Could you please ask your purser to come speak with me?" Linda arrived moments later, her expression already defensive. "Yes," she asked, drawing out the word with irritation. "Your colleague has been very professional." Amara began evenly, nodding at Jordan. "But I've observed comments and behavior from you that fall far short of Sky Nova's stated service standards." Linda scoffed lightly. "Service standards? With all due respect, ma'am, I've been flying longer than he's been alive. I know how to run a cabin." Amara's eyes locked on hers, unblinking. "Then you should know better than to belittle passengers or dismiss colleagues who show compassion. Experience is valuable, but arrogance is not." Linda bristled. "And who exactly are you to lecture me about my job?" For a moment, the cabin seemed to hush, the hum of engines filling the silence. Amara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I'm the person responsible for ensuring that Sky Nova is no longer a place where passengers are made to feel small. My name is Dr. Amara Lewis. I am the majority owner of this airline." Linda's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then glanced toward Jordan, who stood frozen, eyes wide. A ripple of recognition passed through the cabin as nearby passengers realized who Amara was. Phones subtly lifted. Recording. "I suggest you reflect carefully on how you wish this interaction to be remembered," Amara said quietly. Her words were measured, almost gentle, but they landed like hammer blows. "Because from this moment forward, Sky Nova is watching." Linda stumbled over a stammered apology, but Amara raised a hand, silence in her. "This isn't about apologies. It's about accountability. Please step aside. Jordan, would you continue managing the cabin?" Jordan blinked, then nodded, standing taller. "Yes, Dr. Lewis." The rest of the flight unfolded with a newfound attentiveness from the crew. Linda remained silent. Her authority evaporated. Jordan, empowered, delivered service with warmth and precision, and the woman in 3C now calmer. Sipping tea offered Amara a grateful smile as if to say, "Thank you for seeing me." When the plane touched down in Seattle, Amara remained seated until the cabin cleared. She stepped into the galley, where Linda stood stiffly, humiliation etched into her features. "Change is difficult," Amara said softly, almost kindly, "but if you can't meet the standard, Sky Nova will move forward without you. Decide carefully." She left the plane, her heels echoing against the jet bridge. Outside, the cool Seattle air rushed against her face, bracing and invigorating. She drew in a breath, knowing that this was only the beginning. The resistance had shown itself. But so had the hope, the spark in Jordan's eyes, the relief in the passenger's smile. Seeds of a new culture were taking root, even in the shadow of the old, walking toward her waiting car. Amara's thoughts turned inward. Doubt whispered again how many Lindas lurked within the company. Could she excise them all without breaking the body in half? She remembered her father's words once more. Your accent is the music of your history. She straightened her shoulders. Sky Nova's future would be written not by those who sneered, but by those who chose to listen, and she would make sure of it. By the time Dr. Amara Lewis's car pulled away from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The confrontation that had unfolded in the cabin was already spilling into the digital world. A college student in row 4 had recorded the exchange on her phone and uploaded it to social media before the wheels had even touched the runway. The clip wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. No shouting, no scenes of chaos. It was quiet, Amara's calm voice identifying herself as the new majority owner of Sky Nova Airlines, her measured words about accountability, the way the purser Linda Watkins froze, her authority dissolving midair, but that quietness was exactly what made it viral. By the time Amara reached her downtown hotel, the video had been retweeted 30,000 times. By the time she ordered room service tea, it was trending worldwide under the hashtag #SkyNovaShift. Commentators dissected every detail the way Linda's condescension was laid bare, the ripple of recognition through the cabin, the stunned silence that followed Amara's reveal. Power doesn't always shout. One viral post read, "Sometimes it speaks softly and still shakes the room." Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, the fallout was instant. Robert Lane, Sky Nova's CEO, was on the phone with board members who were equal parts alarmed and exhilarated. Alarmed because the company was once again in the spotlight for mishandling customers. Exhilarated because for the first time the story wasn't only about failure. It was about a leader stepping in to demand change. But not everyone was celebrating. A faction of senior crew members fired off angry emails, claiming they felt targeted by the new cultural initiatives. A union representative accused the company of humiliating a veteran attendant in public. Whispers spread through crew lounges. The new boss doesn't respect seniority. Amara watched it all unfold from her hotel suite, sipping her tea in silence. She wasn't immune to the storm. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from allies and critics alike. Supporters urged her to keep going. Detractors warned her she was moving too fast, risking rebellion within the ranks. For a moment, she let herself feel the weight of it, the isolation of leadership. Was she tearing the company apart before it could be rebuilt? Doubt curled in her chest, whispering that perhaps Robert had been right. Perhaps she should slow down. But then she remembered the look on the passenger's face in seat 3C, that small flicker of gratitude when someone finally stood up against quiet cruelty. That look was her compass. The next morning, Sky Nova's crisis communications team assembled in the boardroom. Screens glowed with charts of social media engagement. A marketing director tried to spin the event as a demonstration of customer-first leadership. Robert, looking tired, added that the virality could be turned into positive branding if handled correctly. Amara listened, her expression unreadable, until the room fell into its usual cycle of jargon and half-measures. Then she spoke. "This isn't a Brandon opportunity," she said softly, but the weight in her tone cut through the chatter. "This is a referendum. People are asking whether Sky Nova will live up to the values it claims to hold. If we spin, we lose credibility. If we act, we gain trust." The room fell silent. Even Robert lowered his eyes. Amara turned to Grace Nakamura, the senior VP of in-flight operations. "Grace, what is being done about Linda Watkins?" Grace hesitated, glancing at Robert. "We've placed her on administrative leave pending investigation." "Not enough," Amara replied. "The video makes clear what occurred. We don't punish truth-tellers. We don't protect arrogance. Termination. Effective immediately." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Amara, let's not make hasty." Her gaze cut to him, calm but piercing. "This isn't haste. This is clarity. The world has seen who we are. Now it's time to show them who we intend to be." There was no further argument. Grace nodded, already drafting the paperwork. Outside the corporate walls, the video continued to climb. Late-night hosts replayed it with commentary, praising Amara's composure. News outlets ran features on her meteoric rise, the daughter of immigrants who had conquered aerospace and now aviation. But alongside the praise came skepticism. Editorials questioned whether one leader could truly overhaul an airline culture that had calcified over decades. Amara read those critiques with care. They were fair questions, and privately, she asked herself the same thing. Could empathy really compete with the gravitational pull of cynicism? Could one person's vision outweigh the inertia of thousands of resistant employees? Her answer came unexpectedly from Jordan Ellis, the young flight attendant who had stepped up on the Chicago-Seattle flight. 2 days later, Amara received an email from him. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. He thanked her for trusting him in the moment, for affirming his instincts instead of undermining them. "For the first time since I joined this airline," he wrote, "I feel like doing the right thing actually matters. I want to help build this culture. Whatever role you think I can play, I'm ready." She read the email twice, then again, her chest tightening with something that felt like hope. Jordan wasn't a manager, wasn't a policymaker. He was a single crew member at the bottom of the hierarchy, but his words proved the reforms were working not everywhere, not yet, but somewhere. Seeds were germinating. She replied with equal brevity, "Jordan, thank you. Stay the course. The new Sky Nova begins with people like you." That night, she allowed herself a rare indulgence, a walk through the city without security detail. The streets of Seattle buzzed with the ordinary hum of live food carts, buskers, commuters with earbuds. She thought of her parents, who had worked 2 jobs each to send her to college, who had endured slots and sneers of their own, but had never stopped believing in her. She thought of her own accent, once mocked, now replayed across the internet as a symbol of calm authority. As she crossed a street, a woman approached her hesitantly. She was the same passenger from seat 3C. Dr. Louis Amara blinked, then smiled. "Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't just help me. You reminded me I deserved to be there." Her voice trembled slightly. That meant more than I can explain. Amara felt her throat tighten. She reached out, lightly touching the woman's shoulder. "You do deserve to be there. Never forget it." They parted ways, but the encounter lingered. It reminded Amara that leadership wasn't abstract. It was lived, one passenger at a time. Back at her hotel, she opened her laptop and began drafting the next phase of reforms. Not slogans, not campaigns, action, mandatory cultural audits of every base, anonymous reporting channels expanded. a new leadership program designed specifically to elevate voices historically excluded from aviation, and a promise any employee who mocked, belittled, or diminished passengers would face consequences not eventually, not after layers of bureaucracy, but immediately. By the time she closed the document, the city outside had gone quiet. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. The viral storm had been brutal, but it had also crystallized her mission. Resistance was real, yes, but so was momentum. She knew there would be more Lindas, but there would also be more Jordans. And that, she decided, was worth every battle ahead. The first week after the viral incident brought Skynova Airlines more attention than it had seen in years. Public opinion was split. Passengers praised Dr. Amara Lewis for her poise and integrity, while a subset of crew members seethed with resentment. In break rooms from Atlanta to Los Angeles, veteran attendants muttered that Amara had humiliated Linda Watkins. Others claimed she was dismantling a culture built on seniority, replacing it with political correctness. The union picked up the banner. A letter, circulated within days, accused Amara of publicly undermining a crew member's dignity and warned of possible strike action if due process wasn't respected. It was the kind of language that played well with workers who felt overlooked, even if it ignored the deeper truth of Linda's behavior. Amara read the letter alone in her office, the Seattle skyline stretching beyond the glass wall. For a moment, fatigue pressed down on her. She could almost hear her father's voice. "They'll resist. Amara, power never concedes without a fight." She let herself close her eyes, recalling the weight of Linda's sneer on that flight, the way it echoed every dismissal she'd ever endured. This was not the time to waver. That evening, she called a private meeting with Robert Lane and Grace Nakamura. Robert looked pale. His tie loosened. Grace carried a folder stuffed with reports. The union's positioning itself as defender of tradition. Robert began, his tone edged with frustration. "We can't afford a strike. Amara, not now. Not with the financial state we're in." Grace slid the folder across the table. "But we also can't afford to backtrack. Look at these numbers. Customer satisfaction spiked 18% after the reforms were announced. Social media sentiment is overwhelmingly positive. Investors are calling this the most decisive leadership they've seen in a decade." Robert rubbed his temples. Positive spin doesn't fix grounded planes. Amara remained quiet for a moment, then spoke with measured calm. "We don't negotiate with prejudice. We negotiate with people who are ready to serve with dignity. If the union wants to strike over the right to sneer at passengers, let them. I promise you, the public won't stand with them." Her tone left no room for argument. Robert sank back in his chair, muttering, "You're gambling with fire?" "No," Amara replied. "I'm drawing a line." News of the meeting leaked within days, fueling speculation. Pundits debated whether Amara was a visionary reformer or a reckless idealist. Crew lounges turned into battlegrounds, junior attendants whispering their support, while veterans scoffed that she was out of touch. It was in this atmosphere that Amara made her boldest move, yet she announced the Dignity in Service Initiative, a sweeping overhaul of training and accountability. Every crew member, regardless of seniority, would undergo immersive workshops led by experts in bias recognition, empathy, and de-escalation. Salaries would include performance-based bonuses tied directly to passenger feedback, not seniority. The reaction was explosive. Younger employees cheered the changes. finally seeing a pathway to recognition beyond years served. Older crew members fumed, arguing that experience was being devalued. The union doubled down, calling for a vote of no confidence in management. Amara anticipated it all, but she also anticipated something else: courage rising in unexpected places. 2 weeks later, in a packed town hall streamed live to employees worldwide, Amara stood on stage. The room buzzed with tension. Reporters, executives, and crew filled every seat. Cameras broadcast her image to tens of thousands of homes. Robert gave a perfunctory introduction, his voice flat. Then Amara stepped to the podium. She didn't use slides or notes, she simply spoke. When I flew from Chicago to Seattle 2 weeks ago, I was not just a passenger. I was the owner of this airline. Yes, but I was also a black woman sitting in seat 2A, and what I experienced in that cabin was not just poor service. It was contempt. Contempt for a paying customer. Contempt rooted in prejudice. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some crossed their arms. Others leaned forward. For too long, we've mistaken arrogance for professionalism. We've allowed seniority to become a shield for cruelty. And we've forgotten something fundamental: passengers don't buy seats. They buy trust. Trust that they'll be treated with dignity from the moment they step into our care. When we break that trust, we don't just lose customers, we lose our soul. Her voice didn't rise, but its steadiness carried through the hall like steel. I know change is hard. I know some of you feel attacked, but let me be clear, this is not about tearing down seniority. This is about raising up respect. Experience is valuable, yes, but only when it guides, not when it intimidates. If you can embrace that, then your place here is no longer secure. The silence was electric. Then a voice broke through. It was Jordan Ellis, standing in the back of the hall. The young attendant's voice, carried despite the microphone not being his. She's right. I saw it happen on that flight. I saw the way passengers were treated. And I saw what it meant when someone finally stood up and said, "Enough." The room rippled with murmurs. Some clapped, others scowled. But the moment had landed. Amara continued, her gaze sweeping the crowd. We are building an airline worthy of its passengers. An airline where no accent is mocked, no request dismissed, no human being diminished. If that feels threatening, then ask yourself why. And if that feels inspiring, then stand with me. Together, we can make Sky Nova not just profitable, but principled. Applause began slowly, scattered, then swelled until the hall shook with it. The cameras captured everything. By the next morning, clips of the speech were viral headlines blaring phrases like, "Amara draws the line and dignity takes flight." But beneath the applause, opposition hardened. The union accelerated its vote. Anonymous forums lit up with threats of sabotage, whispers of walkouts, late one night. Amara sat alone in her office, staring out at the city lights. The noise was deafening: critics, allies, journalists, employees all pulling at her vision. For the first time in years, she let herself whisper her doubt aloud. What if they're right? What if I'm breaking more than I'm building? The question hung in the quiet. Then she remembered Jordan's voice in the town hall, clear and unwavering. She remembered the gratitude in the eyes of the passenger from seat 3C. She remembered her father's words, "Your accent is the music of your history. Never let them silence it." Her resolve returned. She picked up her pen and began outlining contingency plans for potential strikes. If they wanted to test her resolve, she would be ready. because this wasn't just about one flight attendant or one viral video. This was about rewriting the DNA of an airline, and revolutions, she knew, were never gentle. The first rumblings of a strike began quietly, almost like distant thunder on the horizon. Crew lounges in Miami, Dallas, and San Francisco buzzed with talk of taking a stand against Amara Lewis's reforms. Anonymous flyers appeared on bulletin boards with slogans like "Protect Seniority," "Protect Ourselves." By the time the week closed, the whispers had become a roar. The union announced a coordinated demonstration on a single Friday morning. Attendants across multiple hubs would walk off duty, grounding flights and forcing SkyNova to cancel hundreds of departures. For passengers, it meant chaos. Families stranded, business travelers scrambling, the press gleefully documenting the meltdown. For Amara, it meant her philosophy was on trial, not in the boardroom, but in the court of public opinion. The news broke just after dawn. Amara sat in her corner office in Seattle, her phone buzzing relentlessly. Grace Nakamura stood at the window, reading updates as they poured in. Robert Lane slumped at the table, his tie loosened, his face gray. They've walked out in New York, Atlanta, Houston, and L.A., Grace said. That's a third of our network paralyzed. Robert turned to Amara, exasperated. We warned you this would happen. They're going to sink this airline just to prove you wrong. Amara leaned back, hands steepled, her eyes calm but her chest heavy. Inside, a storm raged. Doubt whispered that Robert might be right, that she had underestimated the depth of resentment, that her reforms were too much, too fast. But another voice pushed back the voice of her mother, gentle yet unyielding. Respect isn't earned by avoiding conflict. Amara, it's earned by standing through it. She inhaled deeply. We don't cave, she said finally. Robert blinked. What do you mean, we don't cave? Flights are grounded. We're bleeding millions? Amara's voice was steady. If we give in, we validate the culture we're trying to change. This isn't just a labor dispute. This is about whether cruelty is protected by tradition. If I lose this fight, SkyNova becomes just another airline with pretty slogans and no spine. Grace nodded slowly. Then, we need to turn this from a battle of noise into a battle of clarity. Amara's plan took shape quickly. First, she ordered the communications team to release a statement. Blunt and unapologetic SkyNova. Airlines is committed to dignity and service. Today's disruption is the result of resistance to reforms designed to protect passengers and employees alike from prejudice and contempt. We regret the inconvenience to our customers, but we will not compromise on respect. The statement went viral within hours. Hashtags like Dignity First and Passengers Over Politics trended. News anchors debated whether Amara was reckless or courageous. Passengers stranded in airports posted videos, some angry, others supportive. But Amara wasn't content with press releases. She went to the heart of the storm. That afternoon, she flew to New York, where JFK's Terminal 5 had become the epicenter of the walkout. Dozens of attendants stood with picket signs, chanting slogans. Cameras swarmed, capturing the spectacle. Into this chaos stepped Amara, dressed not in a power suit but in a simple navy blazer, her hair pulled back neatly. No entourage, no bodyguards, just her, walking calmly toward the protest line. The chanting faltered as the crowd recognized her. Signs lowered, cameras whirred. One of the attendants, a woman in her 50s with fire in her eyes, stepped forward. "You think you can run this airline without us," she spat. "You think you can shame us into obedience." Amara met her gaze, her voice calm. "No, I think I can lead this airline with you, but not if your leadership comes at the expense of respect." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some scowled, others looked uncertain. Amara raised her voice just enough to carry. "I sat in seat 2A and watched how contempt poisoned service. I saw how small cruelties, left unchecked, become a culture, and I promised myself I would never let another passenger endure that, not while I had the power to change it." She paused, scanning their faces. "I know many of you feel attacked. I know change feels like betrayal, but this is not betrayal. This is a reset. Seniority is not a license to belittle. Experience should guide, not intimidate. And if we can't agree on that, then yes, perhaps we cannot fly together." The silence was profound. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Then, from the back of the crowd, a familiar voice spoke. It was Jordan Ellis. He had flown in overnight, still in uniform, his Sky Nova badge visible. He stepped forward, placing himself beside Amara. "She's right," Jordan said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I joined this airline because I believed in what it could be, not what it was. I've seen passengers cry from the way they were treated. I've seen junior attendants bullied into silence. Enough is enough. We're better than this." The effect was electric. Some attendants looked away in shame. Others whispered among themselves. A few lowered their picket signs entirely. The woman who had confronted Amara earlier crossed her arms, but her voice had softened. "And what about us? What do we get in this shiny new world of yours?" Amara answered without hesitation. "You get a culture where your experience matters because it inspires, not because it intimidates. You get passengers who leave grateful, not wounded, and you get to retire knowing you left this airline better than you found it." For the first time, her opponent didn't have a comeback. By nightfall, the protest had fractured. Some attendants left, unwilling to stand against the tide of public sentiment now swinging in Amara's favor. Others remained, but the energy was broken. The strike's power was dissolving. Back in her hotel room, Amara sat alone by the window, exhaustion pressing against her bones. She thought of the faces in the crowd, the anger, the fear, the flickers of hope. She thought of Jordan's courage, of Grace's steady support, of Robert's wary pragmatism, and she thought of Linda Watkins, the purser who had started it all. One woman's sneer had exposed an entire system's rot, and now, here she was, fighting to rebuild something worthy from the ashes. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grace Votes coming in. "Looks like the strike will collapse. Most hubs are returning to work tomorrow." Amara exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Relief mingled with the knowledge that this was not the end, only another beginning. She whispered to herself, half prayer, half vow. "We're not breaking, we're becoming." The next morning, headlines told the story in bold print, "Lewis faces down strike." Passengers shared clips of her speech at JFK, describing it as the moment dignity took the microphone. Investors rallied. The stock, which had dipped in the morning, rebounded by close of market. But for Amara, it wasn't about the stock. It was about the slow, grinding process of change. She knew there would be more battles, more backlash, more nights staring out at city lights wondering if the cost was too high. Still, she also knew this revolutions aren't won by avoiding storms. They're won by walking through them, steady step by steady step, until the sky clears. And in that knowledge, Dr. Amara Lewis found the strength to continue. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy with the scent of rain. For Sky Nova Airlines, the walkout had been a crucible, an ordeal that could have destroyed the company, but instead revealed its true mettle. 1 week later, Dr. Amara Lewis stood in the atrium of Sky Nova's Seattle headquarters. It was a cavernous space, sunlight streaming through glass walls that reflected the skyline. Rows of employees, from pilots to mechanics to call center reps, filled the floor. The buzz of anticipation was electric. This was not a press conference. It was not a staged corporate event with choreographed applause. This was something rawer, a family meeting after a crisis. Amara stepped up to the podium. She wore a dark green dress, simple but elegant. No jewelry except her watch. She looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some weary, many curious. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the calm gravity of someone who had weathered the fire and emerged tempered. I stood in front of you 3 weeks ago as the new owner of Sky Nova Airlines. She began. Back then, I told you that respect would be our new standard. Some of you welcomed it, others doubted it. And this past week, those doubts became louder than the engines on our planes. There was a ripple of nervous laughter. Amara's mouth curved into a faint smile. But here's the truth: we made it through. Not because we avoided conflict, but because we faced it together. The strike ended not with a contract loophole or a backroom deal, but with a conversation in front of cameras and passengers, with honesty instead of slogans. That is the Sky Nova I believe in. A wave of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling. She raised a hand for quiet. I will not pretend this journey is finished. Change is never tidy. There will be more resistance, more hard days, more moments when you wonder if it's worth it. But I promise you this: every battle we fight will be in service of a future where this airline isn't just profitable, it's principled. She paused, letting the words settle. Some of you may still think I'm naive, that passengers don't care about dignity, that all they want is cheaper fares and free pretzels. But I disagree. I believe people remember how they were treated long after they forget what they paid. And if we build a culture where dignity comes standard, everything else, loyalty, revenue, growth will follow. The atrium erupted in applause again, louder this time. Amara stepped back, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw Jordan Ellis standing tall near the front, clapping with a fierce pride. She saw Grace Nakamura, composed as always, but with a spark of satisfaction in her eyes. Even Robert Lane, once the loudest skeptic, was clapping with genuine conviction. It was not the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a movement. 2 months later, the first quarterly results since the reforms were released. Passenger satisfaction scores had jumped by 37%. Complaints of discrimination dropped dramatically. For the first time in 5 years, Sky Nova posted a profit, modest but real. Investors who had doubted Amara's philosophy began calling it visionary. But for Amara, the most meaningful moment came not from spreadsheets, but from a letter. It arrived in a plain, white envelope, slipped into her office mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in neat cursive. Dr. Lewis. I was on the flight where it all began. I was in seat 4C, across the aisle. watching how you were treated. At the time, I said nothing. I regret that. I regret letting silence be my shield. But I want you to know that your composure that day changed me. It made me ask myself what kind of man I wanted to be. Since then, I've spoken up twice on other flights when I saw someone being treated unfairly. Small things, maybe, but things I would have ignored before. So, thank you for showing me that strength doesn't have to be loud, and dignity doesn't have to be demanded to be undeniable. Sincerely, a fellow traveler. Amara read it 3 times, each word settling into her heart like a quiet benediction. She kept the letter in her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder this was why she fought. 1 year after the strike, Sky Nova unveiled its new flagship service, the Horizon Suites. The launch flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo was more than a ribbon cutting. It was a symbol. Every detail, from the hand-stitched leather to the circadian lighting, reflected the philosophy that had guided Amara from the beginning: efficiency and empathy, side by side. On that flight, the purser was Patricia Monroe, a veteran attendant who had once lived under the shadow of the old culture. Now, she radiated warmth, leading her team with confidence. Jordan Ellis, promoted to lead attendant, worked alongside her, his steady presence a testament to the power of quiet courage. And in seat 2A, as always, sat Dr. Amara Lewis. She watched as Patricia comforted a nervous child, as Jordan helped an elderly passenger store his bag, as a new hire beamed with pride while serving dinner. It was no performance. It was genuine. It was what she had fought for. As the aircraft leveled at 38,000 feet, Amara closed her eyes and let the hum of the engine steady her thoughts. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made to give her a future. She thought of the sneer that had started it all, a single act of prejudice that had tried to reduce her. And she thought of how that moment had become a turning point, not just for her, but for thousands of employees and millions of passengers. Doubt still whispered at times. Was it worth the chaos, the sleepless nights, the headlines calling her arrogant or reckless? But then she would see a smile from a passenger, hear a thank you from a crew member, or hold a letter from someone whose perspective had shifted, and she would know the answer. Yes, it was worth it. As the sun rose over the Pacific, casting a golden glow across the horizon, Amara whispered to herself, a private vow. This is only the beginning, for in the end, the true legacy of Dr. Amara Lewis was not measured in profits or press coverage. It was measured in the quiet revolution she sparked in the way passengers were treated, in the pride of employees who once felt voiceless, in the dignity that became Sky Nova's new currency. The sneer at 35,000 feet had been a costly mistake for one attendant. But for the world of aviation, it had become something priceless, a reminder that respect, once dismissed as optional, was in fact the very engine of trust. And so, under the steady leadership of a woman who had once been mocked for her accent, Sky Nova soared into a future where every voice mattered, every passenger counted, and every journey was an opportunity to honor the humanity that makes us all equal at altitude. And so it ended where it began in seat 2A. A single sneer, a single moment of mockery became the spark for a revolution inside an airline and a reminder for the world. Dr. Amara Lewis didn't shout, didn't lash out. She responded with something far more powerful: quiet strength, empathy, and unshakable dignity. In doing so, She not only changed the fate of one flight attendant, she transformed the culture of an entire company and reminded millions that respect is not optional. But this story isn't only about her, it's about us. How many times have we seen prejudice and said nothing? How many times have we laughed nervously, looked away, or let silence shield us? This story holds up a mirror, asking, who are we when the test comes at 35,000 feet or at ground level in our everyday lives? Let's honor those who choose dignity over cruelty, empathy over arrogance. And let's never forget that the smallest act of prejudice carries the highest cost not only for the one who commits it, but for the humanity we lose if we let it slide. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Join us for the next journey where every story is a flight toward truth, justice, and the power of respect.